Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Kellam. Welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. I serve as the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott. If you've ever been to the hospital to visit a friend or a relative, maybe you found it kind of awkward. You weren't sure what to say, what not to say, what to ask, what not to ask, even where to sit or whether to stand. If you've been a patient in the hospital, maybe you've kind of wanted to reach out to people nobody was visiting. Or maybe you had too many visitors and you really couldn't get any sleep. You needed to find healing and peace, but folks kept coming through the door. So you wanted to put up a no visitors sign, but don't feel like you want to be off-putting at the same time. Well, during this time of COVID, of course, visiting in the hospital is sometimes quite limited. But once we get back to normal visits to the hospital, we're going to answer some of these questions for you. And our guest is the newest member of the Broome County Council of Churches family, the Reverend Dr. Greg Johnson, who is the chaplain both at Binghamton General Hospital and at Wilson Hospital, where, interesting factoid, I was born. Welcome to Encounter. Welcome back.
Well, thank you.
Different role, different hat this time.
Yes, yes.
So how long have you been a chaplain here?
I started with the Council of Churches in May of this year, 2021. Yes.
So what have you discovered? What did you expect, and what surprises have met you in your work here?
I have been involved in chaplaincy for the better part of 20 years. So hospital chaplaincy is something that is not foreign to me. Now, what is different today is the policies for COVID. Patients, they're the same. It depends on the patient, it depends on what their challenge is, their needs, and where they are on their spiritual journey. So that's pretty much the same. I have encountered, again, the more people are concerned about COVID, there is a large variety of perspectives, even from patients in the hospital. However, one of the main things that I've noticed is that people who come to the hospital after having contracted COVID are more likely, if they have not been vaccinated, to be vaccinated. And so that's what I've encountered in the hospitals here at UHS.
Yeah. And apart from COVID, a chaplain could be called upon for everything from a broken finger to a heart attack.
Yes.
And you're on the go between two hospitals. How do you manage the stress that you find yourself under?
Walks. I do a lot of walking and listening to music and reading, and so I can separate myself from what I'm working with by just taking the time for me. And that's important. Also, you're right. When I'm working, people call chaplains from anything from a broken finger to a loved one dying. We also want to realize that not only the patients utilize chaplains, but the staff as well. We are there for the entire hospital, and so especially now with you've heard the religious exemption and the mandate for vaccination about last month when that came out. Staff here at UHS, they were very stressed. Some people were wondering what would happen, will they have a job, and how would they respond. So we were there, or we are there for the staff as well. So we're working with the staff, but we're also there for the staff.
Sure. It's also important to point out this is an ecumenical ministry that I guess when folks come into the hospital, they can indicate some sort of religious background or religious presence. But you don't have to ask someone's creed before you minister to them.
No, this is an ecumenical ministry, and individuals oftentimes will not indicate whether they have a faith tradition or not. And that's important for the individual. It's not necessarily important for the chaplaincy from the perspective of visitation. We're here for all patients. Yeah. And so whether they are Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, we're here for all patients.
Yeah. Tell me about the other chaplains at both hospitals. You've been working with them now for several months. What traditions do they represent?
What we have right now, just the Protestant, which myself, I represent, and we have Catholic chaplains, both at Wilson and Binghamton General. And so we service all of the patients together, but these are the two chaplains that we have here on staff at UHS.
Right. Now, like a doctor, do you do rounds or do you wait for a call?
We do rounds. We try to see both patients that indicate their religious preference as well as those who do not indicate their religious preference. We're a small group, and if you look at the large scale of how big the both hospitals are, we're looking at a combination of a little over 300 beds, and so it's only we have on staff, we're short one chaplain, so we have on staff 5 chaplains between the two hospitals. And so we're trying to reach as many people as we can. And we do rounds. A typical day for me is I walk in the morning, I set up, log in, do the temperature check, care check, you make sure that I give all the information pertinent for the COVID check-ins, but then I pull up the patients for the hospitals and run a printout of units in each hospital and the patients that I will be visiting for each unit. And it starts with who's been here the shortest, the first day persons, and then looking at the particular reference to spirituality. Now, that can be interesting as well, because in the hospitals, especially at Wilson, you have 2-room occupancies. And so you have an A and a B bed. Well, if I'm going to see person in bed B, I have to speak to person in bed A. And they may not have been on my list for someone to see, but I still need to be polite in the visitation and speak with them, as well as ask if there's anything that they are in need of or I can do for them.
Sure. Now, when you're working with staff, do you have meetings offering spiritual support, workshops? Is there anything that goes on that's a connector between you and the staff?
Well, not at the moment. What we are doing is engaging with the nursing staff units to let them know that even now we're here with them and sharing our thoughts and prayers. And for those who want to pray, we are open for that.
Yeah. Both hospitals have small chapels. Are people using chapels?
People have asked about both the chapels, and I have not seen people use the chapels. I do know that they are being utilized.
Yeah. Especially not so much by patients, perhaps, but by families. who are struck by the severity sometimes of the illness that they didn't expect.
Yeah, families are going in, yes.
What kind of training does a chaplain receive?
Well,
going back to seminary, certainly.
Chaplains, well, today one of the criterias for chaplaincy, and a lot of hospitals are using that as a standard, is CPE training, clinical pastoral education, and the minimum is 1 unit of clinical pastoral education, and that's for 3 to 4 months working in a hospital under supervision, doing clinicals as well as reporting verbatims about yourself and interacting with the patients that you see.
Yeah. So there is special training.
There is special training, especially for staff chaplains. Now we do utilize, or have utilized, volunteers. Volunteers don't necessarily need CPE. They will go through volunteer training. However, now we are not utilizing volunteers because of COVID.
Right. Yes, when I was a pastor in Trumansburg, the Cayuga Medical Center was practically down the road from the church, and I remember making some visits, and some folks from local churches would come in. They too would go to the desks to see who in their tradition was hospitalized. I don't know how the HIPAA things work out with that, but so I would be visiting with one of my parishioners, and another person would come in and say, I represent such and such a church, and they wouldn't know that I was a pastor necessarily. So we would bump into one another, and I so appreciated the fact that many churches have deacons or have just that person whose specialty is maybe not counseling, but simply being there, a presence. Someone to say, hello, how are you doing today? Not proselytizing, but just what a good feeling that must be to be a volunteer like that.
Yes, and the volunteers come from various faith traditions. Prior to COVID, there were volunteers from Protestants, Catholics, Jewish, and so that was good. Now we don't have that, but yes, that makes a difference.
Yeah. To the person in the bed, as well as to your work. Pardon the expression, workload. That's not the best way to put it. Ministry. I mentioned at the outset of the program, incidentally, not incidentally, it's a major fact that our guest is the Reverend Dr. Greg Johnson, who is the chaplain both at Wilson Hospital as well as Binghamton General. I mentioned that we would be talking about maybe some protocols, we're used to that word these days, for people who go to visit the hospital. What are some do's and don'ts that you offer for folks who might find a hospital visitation of a friend or relative kind of awkward or difficult?
One of the things that I share, and I taught my deacons at the church that I pastored, is especially for ministers and deacons, if you're going to visit with persons of your congregation, be brief. One, it's important to respect the patient's time and space. When you are a patient in the hospital, you are vulnerable. You're laying in bed, you are not dressed, and some people feel very vulnerable at that particular time. And so my first training is to say, be brief. While you are visiting, and this is for persons who are visiting members of their church, one do not do is, it is very insincere to say, I know how you feel. You don't. You don't. You may have been in the hospital, you may have had the same type of illness. Everybody's journey is different. And so it's good to take the cue from the patient what is it that you would like for me to do? Would you like prayer? Would you like reading from the scripture? To be honest, Jeff, a lot of the training, even though I've been trained in CPE, I've been pastoring for over 20 years, as I think back, my paternal grandmother really began this journey for me without me realizing it. She was, as a young adult in my 20s, she was ill. She was bedridden. She was in and out of the hospital. And so when I went to visit her, she would say, "Get the Bible for me. Read." And often I'd read some of the same passages. And so I said, "Well, why are we reading the same passages?" She said, "Because it makes me feel better." So those are touchstone things that individuals would be mindful of when they're visiting persons in the hospital. Family is a different story. Essentially, when you're visiting family members, again, I would say take your cue from the patient. If they are members of the family and they desire for you to stay a little bit longer, take your cue from the patient. That is key. You can't go wrong if you're taking your cue from the patient.
Right. Going back to the, I know how you feel statement that we try to avoid, there is a propensity to kind of think, well, I had the same issue. When I had my knee replacement, this happened. Or when I was pregnant, that happened. That's not helpful either, to rehearse your medical history for a person in the hospital bed.
Not then, no. After they are out of the hospital, recovering on their particular journey, then that might be a good time to say, hey, this was helpful to me. But like I said earlier, individuals who are patients in the hospital, they're vulnerable. And rehearsing what happened to you and what you experience will be not as valuable then as it could be later on.
Now, folks are often curious about why someone is hospitalized. And sometimes that curiosity is simply the foundation of some gossip, but sometimes it's a sincere desire to know how serious it is. How do you approach that as a visitor to someone? Is it any of your business, or should you wait for them to volunteer any information?
Well, like I said, family, that's a whole different thing. And even with some family members, they will only share with certain people of the family. And it is, again, the patient's prerogative. I would not encourage individuals who are visiting as a visitor to visit the patient. Well, why are you here? That is intrusive, to be honest with you. They are here, they're in the hospital because they're sick. Bottom line. And here's something else that we want to keep in mind. One of the things that people do, and this is something that we do generally in our culture, is say, "Hi, how are you doing?" If I'm a patient in the hospital bed and you come in and ask me how am I doing, today I might look at you and say, well, look at where I am. Some patients are not as forthcoming, and while they say they're okay, look at where they are. And so instead, be thoughtful is what I'm trying to say. Instead of saying, how are you doing? Be specific. You can say, how are you doing today? As opposed to a general, how are you doing? Or how are you feeling today? That's a little more specific with the individual that you're visiting. And then that can lead to a conversation, whether they choose to share with you how they feel and why they are there.
Sure. And someone else had said that it's better to visit early in the day rather than later in the day. Does that make any difference?
it's better to find out what's going on in the hospital when you're visiting. There, in the morning, for example, from probably 7 to 10 o'clock, doctor's round. So it would not be helpful to visit early in the morning. I would say early afternoon would probably be the best time. Not during lunch, but early afternoon or not too late in the evening.
And certainly you check in, we have to check into the hospital now at the very beginning of our visit, but when you get to the floor, it's good to check in with the nurse's station, is it not, rather than just walking in the door?
It is good to check in at the nurse's station, again, because that is helpful to alerting where the patient is. They may not be in the room. They may be in the room and not be ready to receive visitors. So it is a good thing to check and say, hey, I'm here to see patient in room 351. Is it okay? And that's also a sign of respect.
Right. Let's now look at the perspective of the person who's in the bed. And you're thinking, you have a large support group. You've got folks who are praying for you back home at your local church, perhaps, or your synagogue. And so you know that there are many people who care about you, but you also know here you are with all these folks knocking on the door saying, can I come in and say hello? How do you say, I'd really, really rather not have visitors?
One thing that patients can do is work with their pastor if they're involved in a church. I had a member of my congregation says, Pastor, I appreciate you wanting to come, and I know that you are praying with me. I'd rather you not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I said, okay.
Yeah.
And respecting their wishes. And I said, is this a general that you would not like visitations from members? They said yes. So working with the pastor, if you're part of a congregation, will be helpful. And that way the pastor can communicate to the church, hey, this person wants their privacy.
Right.
As far as, with the general population, they can ease that by saying to the unit nursing staff, no visitations.
Yeah. And that is something to respect. And no matter how much you care for a person, it's to invade their privacy or to upset their schedule or to simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And like I said, when patients are in the hospital, I can't overemphasize the vulnerability of an individual when they're in the hospital. And so people are quite vulnerable. Everybody's different though, Jeff. Some people may be okay with the community coming in.
Yeah.
And that's fine for them. Some people may not be. But if you are the type of person that respects your privacy, then you can cultivate, while you're in the hospital, what kind of visitation you'd like.
Right. I know that sometimes I've gone in and I've offered to pray for somebody and they'll say, am I that bad off? How easily does prayer come to the hospital chaplain? Is that simply an invitation, I guess?
For me, it's, again, patient-led. Some patients welcome it, and you can see that that's an expectation after a few minutes with the patient. Some patients are okay. What my philosophy has been for the better part of 10 or 15 years in chaplaincy is that I am a spiritual companion for individuals on this journey. And so I take my cue from them. If they want prayer, that's available. Sometimes I ask, and I may not ask. It just depends on where they are.
We're getting toward the end of our time, but I do want to go back to the idea that you're the chaplain not only to the patients in the hospital, but to nursing staff and to doctors, or to the receptionist. You have to be a pastoral presence to all of them. The staff, nurses, doctors, not only are overwhelmed with the work that they have to do, but the stress that this atmosphere has on all of us. And so being stressed not simply by the work, add the stress of the pandemic, add the stress of individuals leaving jobs because of not wanting to be vaccinated and leaving co-workers holding the bag. So there's a lot of stress that is prevalent throughout, particularly the healthcare, but in our culture in general. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of a busy time here at the hospital. We're sitting here at Wilson Hospital talking with the Reverend Dr. Greg Johnson, and he is the chaplain here at Wilson, but also at Binghamton General Hospital, in work that's sponsored by the Broome County Council of Churches. We often talk about CHOW, we talk about the Greater Good Grocery, food pantries around our areas, but we sometimes forget to talk a little bit about the chaplains too. So many thanks for your being with us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the opportunity.
Encounter is produced for WBNG-TV by the Broome County Council of Churches, with the audio portion of the program carried on some Town Square media stations. Past programs are also available on the Council's website. Go to broomecouncil.net, broomecouncil.net, and look for the Encounter tab. Now this is Jeff Kellam, urging you in the coming week to be gentle with people and with yourself.